Hello and welcome. I'm Kevin Wenning. This is a series of videos that I'm doing around photography refresher exercises. This is designed for folks who are either beginner photographers or maybe you just don't pick up your camera all that often and you're planning a vacation or holiday, you've got some special events coming up and you're thinking, I'd really like to pull out that fancy camera I bought and put it to some good use. But maybe you're a little bit intimidated by it and not know where to start. So this series of videos is designed to, first of all, help you get comfortable with your camera again, and then after that, walk you through some scenarios that you'll encounter in travel photography, since that's my specialty. And the idea is to give you some practice before you actually go on that vacation so you're ready to come home with photos that you're proud of. And in each video, I'll give examples based on my own photos, as well as exercises for you to work through. So all of those are downloads off of my website. And then on each page, I'll give you exercises. Making a photo that looks like each of these will help you to exercise or practice that specific topic that we're covering. And then I'm going to end the series with, or rather add on to the series here, some basic photo editing, because I feel strongly that learning to do some basic photo editing, understanding the components that make up your image, makes you a better photographer at the point of capture. F-stop and aperture. What does that mean? F-stop and aperture on your Photography 101 sheet, it's going to be kind of right here, also right down here, although as I'm just talking about this now, I realize these two labels are switched. When you have a shutter that looks like this, you actually have more depth of field, and on the other side, when you have an f2 aperture, that means that your blades are going to be open wider on your lens, and you actually have less depth of field. What does that mean? Let's look at some example images. I'm going to go from shallow depth of field and more light to a deep depth of field and less light in these examples. If you look on our worksheet, we're going to talk about, first of all, the range from f2.8 to f4. That means that you're going to have shallow depth of field. In that case, that does allow you to have more light coming into the lens. In this case, our infographic over here is correct. When you have a larger f-stop, and larger just means how wide the blades are open, how much light is coming into your lens when you're clicking the shutter. So an f2 range gives you a lot more light into the shutter. That means that you're going to have a brighter image than the other end of the spectrum, which could be anything from an f16 and above. That means that you're going to have a darker image or less light coming into the frame. But in order to expose those correctly, you need to leave the shutter open for longer. Shutter speed we just talked about on the last bit of the video. So when the shutter is open for longer, you're gathering more light information, which means that more parts of the image can be in focus. Humor me, there's something I want you to try with me real quick. If you are driving or you're riding your bike, don't try this. Close your eyes and keep them closed for a few seconds. Now I want you to open your eyes real quick and close them again real quickly. Keep them open for a second. Ready? Open your eyes. 1, close them. Okay, now think about what it was that you saw. You gathered a lot of light, but very quickly. So most likely you captured just one small thing that was in front of your eyes at that moment. Everything else is just kind of blurry. You don't know what was there. You might know because you know the room that you're in, but you didn't really see it clearly. You just saw one thing very clearly for a short amount of time. Now, I'm going to try the same thing. Just open your eyes for 5 seconds and then close them again. Ready? Open your eyes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Close your eyes. Okay. In that 5 seconds, you probably gathered a lot more information. More images, more shadows, more lights, more things in the room came into focus, whatever was in front of your eyes at the time. Okay, go ahead and open your eyes. So that's kind of a really rough, crude example of what we're dealing with both shutter speed and aperture combined, is the difference between just opening and closing very quickly and gathering some information in a very quick time frame versus if you're going to open your shutter for a longer period and you're going to capture more information, which is what we do when we're at f16, f22 and above. There's a smaller pinhole there, but we keep it open for longer. We leave the shutter open for longer so it gathers more light information. So here's a really good example actually. Let's look at this one. This is going to be at, I think it was an f16, possibly even larger. When you have a small aperture. That means that the blades on the lens are closed more. Everything from the very front of the image to these mountains in the distance is in focus. And we do this a lot with landscape photography. You would want to do this primarily on a tripod. You can do this a little bit handheld. Usually you're going to do this on a tripod though. And then the other end of the spectrum is something like this, where I've got a small aperture, or I'm sorry, a really large aperture, meaning that the blades on the lens open wider. I'm getting more light into the lens, and I have a shallow depth of focus. So only a small part of the image is in focus while everything else is blurred. And the whole purpose of doing this is to direct your viewer to what you want them to look at. And in landscape photography, you want them to see everything. You want people to get a sense of the vastness of where you are and everything from what's right in front of me, the rocks, the bushes, the trees, the flowers that I'm standing next to, and everything from there up to the mountains in the distance, or the lake or the river that's way on the other side of of the ravine that I'm looking at. Everything needs to be in focus. So I want you to be able to capture everything in your imagination. When we're doing people photography, when we're doing cultural photography, street photography, a lot of times we want this type of photo where we call attention to just one little part of the frame. So I want you to gather exactly what she's doing here by focusing on one thing. I want you to look at her hand first. That's the brightest part of the image as well as the sharpest part of the image. But then I do want to include everything else in the frame, and that's why I crop it this way. That's why I compose the image this way, because what's going on back here also adds to the story. I really want you to focus here, but then I want to give you a little bit more context as to what's actually going on. Whereas in landscape photography, I want you to get a sense for standing there and looking at this scene. All right. So if we're working through the worksheet here, I'm going to go from our largest apertures from f2.8 to f4, and then we're going to step up through standard aperture, which is going to be around an f8. Usually I use f5.6 to f11 for everyday kind of walk around photography, and then landscape photography where you got special situations where you want everything from right in front of your lens to the vanishing point in the photo, which would be right back here where it kind of disappears. You want everything in that scene to be in focus. So let's go ahead and jump into these examples, and I'm going to do the same thing I did on the last bit of the video here, where we're going to look at just one photo at a time. You can look right here. f2.2 is going to be my aperture on this one. f2.2 right down here. So those are the two places you're going to look to see what exactly is my f-stop. Now I don't give you recipes, and by that I mean I can't say if you use exactly these camera settings, 1/50th of a second, f2.2, ISO 1250, you're going to get exactly this kind of a photo. That's just not the way it works. So for this one, obviously I've got roughly the same shutter speed as well as f-stop, but I've got a much lower ISO. And the reason for that is there was a lot more light in this scene. So this is a much brighter image, a much brighter scene than this guy pouring the tea. And that allows me to have a much lower ISO number, which means that I have a lot less noise or a lot less grain in the image. So let's view this one at full screen. You can see here on the guy's face, there really wasn't much light. The light is coming from behind him. So in order to illuminate his face, I used a very large f-stop, and that allows a lot more light in the scene. So a large f-stop means that the blades on the lens are open much wider, and you get a lot more light in the scene. And then on this one, I could have roughly the same settings. I wanted to do this handheld, which is why I was at 1/50th of a second, f2.8, and then that allows for a very shallow depth of field, meaning I want you to look at this. I want you to pay attention to this. And normally when you're looking at a photo, your eyes are first going to go to the brightest part of the image, which if I hadn't done this with the sharpness, your eyes are probably going to go up here to the white tablets first. And you're going to take that in, and then your eyes would wander out from there to look at the rest of the image. By only allowing a shallow depth of field and focusing on one small part of the image, I'm saying, look here. So the next thing that your eyes are going to do after grabbing the brightest part of the image is they're going to migrate to what's the sharpest thing in this photo. And that's your job as a photographer to show people, I want you to look at this, pay attention here. And that's what sharpness does for us. So that's why a shallow depth of field says, I want to draw your eyes into this part of the image. And then your eyes are going to wander out here and say, hey, what's going on over here? Oh, what's up here? And then they're always going to come back to where you're directing their eyes, which is right down here in the sharpest part of the image. All right, next photo, we already kind of talked about this one. I wanted to focus on her hands right here, give you a sense of who this is, what kind of a person she is. This is a cultural photo. This is in Morocco. This lady is shelling argan nuts, and I really was only allowed in Morocco, and you'll find this in some cultures, specifically Muslim cultures, where they don't want you to photograph their face most of the time, but they're happy if you photograph from their neck down. So I talked to these gals before I started photographing. I said, I really want some close-up shots of your hands. And in her own way, she said, I understand you. That's okay. Go ahead and photograph my hands. So I got really close with my lens and put her hand in focus. You'll do this a lot with nature photography. I've got a couple more images kind of like this, where you want to focus on just one part of the landscape, where you want to focus on just a detail. And this gives a little bit more sense of, rather than just showing a broad, wide open, here's the mountains, here's the lakes, here's the rivers. What's there? I mean, every landscape that you hike through, that you walk through, that you bike through has something unique about it. What kind of flowers are there? What does the flora look like? If you run across animals, you're definitely going to use a fast shutter speed and a wide open aperture like an f.2 to capture those wildlife. And we get into that in one of the later videos in this series as well. Another thing to keep in mind when you're using a wide open aperture like an f2.2, 2.8-ish, you want everything on your subject to be in focus. So let's pull this up here. And what I'm talking about here is everything from the front of the item to the back of the item, the object that we're photographing, should be in focus. And what a lot of people would do here, and what I did when I first started photography, was I'm always going to reach for the largest aperture I can. I want my lens as wide open as possible. I want as much blur in the background as possible. Well, if I were to reach for, let's say, a 1.2 aperture on this one, that would mean that the edges of this petal would not be in focus. So you can see that it's a little bit blurred right here. That's probably because I was hand holding this shot and I might have moved the camera a little bit while I was capturing it. But what you want to keep in mind here, and this is especially true with portrait photography, usually f2.8 is where you're going to start with portrait photography. And that means that you're going to focus on the eye of the person that's closest to the camera, and f2.8 to f3.5-ish usually allows you to keep everything from the tip of their nose to the back of their ear in focus, and then everything behind their head will be blurry, like the situation I've got here with this almond blossom. Now, if you were to use the largest aperture possible, then part of this would be in focus and part of it would be blurry, which is not good because this is my subject. I want every part of my subject to be in focus. All right, these are things that a lot of times I can't explain with photos. You really have to go out and practice. So pick up your camera, start going and photographing some objects around your house. Set up something on your desk. You don't have to be in a travel situation or even go outside of your house to find situations where you can practice this with your camera. You can do this with everyday objects in your house. Like this situation, I can do in my kitchen every day with my kids eating and holding something in their hand or playing with a toy, or with my wife cooking. I could practice this type of a photo where she's moving her hands and I have to pick the right shutter speed that's fast enough and the right f-stop to get just part of the hand in focus while she's doing something else in the background. So these are everyday sort of situations you can practice before you get into a travel situation. All right, moving on with our photo examples. This is a situation that I really love, and this is something that you'll find a lot in the real world. So when you use a shallow depth of field aperture, meaning f2 to f4 range, you want to make sure that everything you want in focus is on the same plane. And this goes back to kind of what I was talking about with the flower, the almond blossom on the tree there. I want every bit of my subject to be in focus, while everything behind it is blurry. So this is a situation, this is a loom of a weaver in Marrakesh, Morocco, and I wanted all of these elements to be in sharp focus. So fortunately, they were all on the same plane. And let's go back to this image here. So this is a situation where there was only one small part of the frame, one small part of the image where I wanted something to be in focus. And if I had walked around to my left here by a couple of steps and put that whole board on the same plane, meaning that it was all the same distance from my lens, then I could have gotten that whole board in focus. I probably could have even gotten his hands in focus, but this is similar to the lady that was shelling argon nuts. I just wanted a small part of the image in focus and the rest of it to be blurred in the background. So I didn't want to photograph this straight on. That's why I photographed it at an angle. Okay, again, this is just kind of an example of something that you've really got to get out and practice. See what works for you. You might like to photograph everything flat, where everything is on a standard plane similar to this. You might want to photograph something on an angle, so you've got just one small part of focus in your image, and then everything else around it is blurred. Now, I'm jumping here next to a standard aperture that you're going to use kind of on everyday walk-around photography, f8. On most lenses, f8 is the middle of your f-stop range. So if you've got a lens that goes from all the way from f2 to f32, f8 is roughly in the middle, and that's usually the point where the lens is the sharpest. It's going to give you the best images, the least aberrations. It's just going to have the highest quality image. So f8 is generally where I set my lens before I go out walking around doing street photography, and it's going to give you the image from near to far, mostly in focus. And the reason that this one isn't completely in focus, we'll click down here in the corner, is mostly due to my lens, not necessarily the f-stop. So if you've got a cheaper lens, the corners of your image are going to be soft like this, but you'll see as I start to work my way up, the grass becomes a little bit crisper and cleaner. And then when we get all the way up here, my focus point was on the barn, and I wanted that to be my hero. That's the subject I'm photographing, so everything there should be in nice, sharp focus. Usually, what I recommend to people is start with focusing about a third of the way into the image. So I would have set my focus point right about here if I wanted everything in focus. If I want just my hero in focus, I'm going to put a focus point up here somewhere in the middle of the barn. Here's another great example of just everyday walk around street photography. This one I photographed at f8. This is just walking around in the streets of Cuba, found these boys playing checkers, and I immediately grabbed a focus point here, probably on this boy's eye, maybe somewhere here in the middle of the checkerboard, and that allows everything from near to far in the scene to render in focus. So that's usually where I'm going to start. Again, if you're working through these on the worksheet, f5.6 to f11 is where you're going to be if you want everything in focus. And again, these situations always change. The big difference between these two scenes is this was kind of a moody day. I had to have a little bit longer shutter speed in order to capture more light, and I could go with a little bit lower ISO. In this situation, usually when I'm walking around and doing street photography, I raise my ISO a little bit to add a little bit more light to the scenes. And then I do that because I want to have a little bit faster shutter speed. So if I'm photographing something that's moving, or if I'm just pulling up my camera trying to take a quick shot, I know that I can always shoot those handheld without trying to set up my camera on a tripod. Hope that all made sense. If not, go back and watch the shutter speed portion of this video, and that'll give you a good idea of kind of how to deal with those situations with your shutter speed. All right, now we're into the portion of the video and these photos where we're talking about having a little bit smaller f-stops. And smaller, again, just means how wide the shutter is opening when you click it, or how wide the blades of the lens are opening when you click the shutter. And this allows you to capture everything from near to far in focus. So if you're following along on our worksheet, that's going to be these two images here where we're at f11 or higher. And again, on the Photography 101 worksheet, that just means that your photo is going to be darker, so you're going to need a little bit longer shutter speed, but that allows you to capture more depth of field. So let's look at these examples. This is one of the temples at Prambanan in Indonesia. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. This is not super sharp. Again, probably not one of my best lenses that I photographed this with, but you can see some good detail in the rocks, even in the grass down here in the foreground, all the way up into the temple here in the distance. And this is the advantage of using a smaller f-stop. You can capture everything from near to far in nice, crisp detail. Another example of how we're going to do this with landscape, I wanted to catch a little bit of the detail down here in the foreground and all the way up to the top of the dune here. You see a little bit of a sun star there. Now, I did that on this one primarily by capturing it right on the edge of the sand dune. And that's just a trick that you learn doing landscape photography. If you get the sun just, peeking out from behind a leaf, peeking out from behind a mountain, you can get a nice little sun star because it's partly occluded there by something. The other way to do that is with your f-stop. So f16 is usually where I start, and then I'll go up to f22 if I really feel like I want a really nice sharp sun star. That means that you get these little, rays of the sun kind of emanating off of it. You see a little bit of smudging up here because I didn't capture this with one of my best lenses. That just has to do with the quality of the glass. And you get those sun stars by the sun rays kind of coming out around each of these little blades of the camera here. So just something to play with, not something you have to do, but just one of those fun little things you get to do with landscape photography. Another example where I wanted the foreground here to be in focus, as well as everything up here in the distance on the mill that was maybe 50 or 60 feet away from me when I snapped the photo. This is one of my example photos on the worksheet for you, right here, where we want to capture everything from these stones that are sitting right in front of me up to the arches there in the far distance. That's, I don't know, maybe 300 yards away from where I'm sitting. And if you zoom in a little bit, we've still got some really nice sharp detail in there. Let's flip back on this to the detail view so you can see exactly what I was doing with this. We've got this at f13. I probably could have gone with a little bit smaller f-stop on this, but the sun was setting. It was getting a little bit dark. I was already at ISO 100. I probably could have gone with a longer shutter speed here to gather a little bit more light, but all of the details where I was setting my camera settings, I wanted to capture a little bit of this light and glow here in the background, as well as the sunset without having the sunset blown out. Zoom into this one here. This is a good example of foreground in focus. So that rock that was sitting right in front of my lens is in nice focus. All the way up to the arches here in the distance are in nice focus. Here's the other example that's on the worksheet. And this is a scene that I drive past every day. This is one that you can go out and practice yourself. Find a landscape in a park next to your house and practice photographing a blade of grass or a flower with a tree in the distance. And again, you're going to want to set your focus probably about a third of the way into the image if you want everything from near to far to be really a nice sharp focus. So I've got the hoarfrost here on the blades of grass in front of me, nice and sharp, as well as everything on these trees. I can see each little branch on these trees there in the far distance. All right, let's look at just one final image here, just for funsies. This is another example. I photographed this right behind my house. There's a big cornfield, and there was this one day when I woke up and there was a blizzard. It was just blowing like crazy, but I looked out the window and there were these 2 bales of hay with snow stuck to them. And my wife thought I was nuts. I said, I'm going out to photograph those. And she looked at me like, you're crazy. And then I showed her the picture after I got done with it. She's like, yeah, that was a pretty cool idea. So, these are types of situations you can find around you every day. I'm not saying you have a cornfield in your backyard, but you can probably find something with an example where you've got a foreground element where you've got a little bit of interest, and then a midground element, and then something in the background that you want everything to be in focus. And this is a good way to practice running through these exercises for f-stop and aperture. Try and make something for each of these situations if you're following along, and try and create something with near to far all in focus. And as far as your compositional elements, if you got something interesting in the foreground, the midground, and the background, that's even better. Then your everyday walk around situations, set your lens to f5.6, f8, something in that range, and just photograph anything that you can find on a daily basis. And then some complex situations where you want to have just one small part of your image in focus, reach for the largest aperture on your lens, which might only be down to an f4. Also keep in mind, if you have a zoom lens and that's what you're working with, that's fine, that's great. Definitely a great travel lens for all situations. I like using zoom lenses myself. But as you zoom that lens out further, it may have a limited f-stop range. So on a couple of my lenses, when I'm zoomed in, I can only go to f5.6 instead of f4 or f3.5 or f2.8. So just keep that in mind with zoom lenses. You're not always going to have that max f-stop range available to you if you're zoomed in on that lens. So all of the concepts that I've talked about here as far as f-stop and aperture are something you have to go put into practice. And see how your camera handles, see how you understand the situation when you're in it. It's not something that you can just show up on location and say, well, I'm just going to let the camera pick it for me. If you have any intention over your photography, you're going to have to understand the difference between the range of f2 to f32 as far as the apertures on your lens. The whole point of doing this practice is to decide when you're making your photos, what exactly do I want them to look like? So let's go back here to the main gallery. Am I more interested in taking photos where they're just standard everyday situations, I'm photographing at f8 range, or do I need to photograph situations like this where I've got just one small part of the image in focus and I really want to direct my viewers to what I want them to understand about this scene? All right, that's everything I have to talk about for f-stop and aperture.